7 years of service gone in a day.
Adrian feels that he's done the job and he has inflation.
But not a word from the man himself. So, was it a breakdown in relations with the finance minister?
Questions about the nature of that resignation are for the Reserve Bank Board.
7 years in office and a 7-word response to say thank you.
Or was it the constant criticism?
He was a little bit arrogant in the way, he saw himself.
Either or, where to now for the Reserve Bank? Welcome to the NBR Podcast. I'm your host, Simon Shepherd. Former Reserve Bank Governor Adrian Orr loved a turn of phrase. From telling people to
just call the jets.
To working out who's in charge of the economy.
Who's the daddy?
But was it his style of communication that got people offside? To take a look back over Orr's controversial 7 years at the helm of the Reserve Bank, we have a podcast panel. Kiwibank's chief economist Jarrod Kerr, founder of investment company Pi Funds Mike Taylor, and Craig Renney, Council of Trade Unions economist and former advisor to Labor Finance Minister Grant Robertson. So I wonder, did any of you see this coming, Jarrod?
We saw the resignation coming at some point, but last week it was, obviously a bit of a shock that it happened on the day, and the way it was done and the way it was communicated was a little weird.
Yeah, a little weird, right? Because of the lack of information or the speed, or both?
Both.
Yeah,
it's just gone. That's it. On annual leave, Christian Hawkesby step in.
Yeah.
So great for Christian. I think Christian's a fantastic, safe pair of hands.
All right. Well, we'll talk about that soon. Craig, I mean, you've been around the finance minister. You've been in the CTU. You've been down in that area for a long time. What did you think of how it happened?
It was unexpected, but it wasn't surprising. I think the governor had been uncomfortable, I think, for some time. There's clearly been a lot of noises that he put in a poor performance, rightly or wrongly, and I think he felt it was time to go. He'd done 7 years as Reserve Bank governor, but the timing, as Jarrod said, and the sort of the speed and the haste of the exit is something else that I think that surprised people.
All right, I'm going to tease that out a little bit in a second. Mike, what was your reaction?
Well, normally when you resign from a job after you've been in there for a long period of time, you put in a notice, you go in 3 or 6 months. You don't just walk out the door the next day.
Yeah.
Which said to me that there's obviously been some sort of issue with government, with Nicola Willis. They've clearly had an argy-bargy about something, and he's decided to just go. Yeah.
Okay. Let's dig down to that a little bit. I mean, there was that sort of clue in the resignation release about, ongoing focus and funding will be critical to these project successes. This is Adrian Orr's words in his resignation letter. So is that a clue, Jarrod?
Yeah, I think it is. I agree with Mike. I think something happened behind the scenes that we're, obviously not aware of. But you know what? Move on. Okay, just before I move on, though. Oh, sorry.
Craig, would you have any insight into this? I mean, because you've been around the machinery of government.
I wish I did. I'd be going up for far better lunches than I am right now. To be deadly honest, there doesn't seem to be anything coming out there. I think, as others have said, it's quite clear there's been a moment that's caused this break. It's quite clear that this is not something that, as others have suggested, has been a long thought-through process.
Yeah.
So the governor's just gone. Again, no notice. And I think, you can intuit some of this from the response of the Minister of Finance, who simply said, "I wish him well for the future."
That was a very sparse response, wasn't it?
Indeed. 7 years in office and a 7-word response to say thank you, I think tells you all you need to know about the amount of love that's been lost between those two characters.
Yeah, not a lot of lines to read between, but we will do that. Okay. Craig, I'm just going to stick with you. So let's jump back in time, 7 years ago, as you say, to when Adrian Orr was appointed. You were working then for Finance Minister Grant Robertson. Can you give any insight then as to why he was chosen?
He was chosen because the Reserve Bank and the Treasury had gone through a sort of a very long recruitment process. But I think the Minister of Finance at the time was looking for someone who could genuinely communicate A lot of the criticism, again, rightly or wrongly, that might have been levelled at Graham Wheeler, the former governor, was that he wasn't a great communicator. He wasn't someone who enjoyed talking to people, talking to New Zealanders about the role of monetary policy and the role of the Reserve Bank in financial stability. Adrian, as the chair of the Super Fund, was someone who quite clearly enjoyed talking to the public, was someone who quite clearly enjoyed talking to New Zealanders, and he was going to bring a breath of fresh air to that particular institution. And I think that's one of the many reasons, that and his very successful handling of the Super Fund, led the then Minister of Finance, Grant Robertson, to think this would be the person who should be leading the Reserve Bank into the future. And of course, at that time, none of us knew what was about to head towards us.
Right.
So, you know, it was a very different universe pre-COVID.
Yes. Well,
And ironically,
Yep.
sorry.
Yeah, that's fine, jump in.
Ironically, that was ultimately his downfall. He came in, he was fantastic to start with, but then, his communication, I would argue, was
so
lacking.
you're saying he wasn't a communicator?
I'm saying the communication we got out of him over the last 5 years was pretty poor.
Right. Okay.
It's very one way, right? So
Right.
like he would talk to you rather than listening back the other way.
Yep.
So
He's a one-way communicator.
yeah.
So did he not enjoy criticism? Do you think, looking at
I don't
that
think
much?
anyone can.
No, that's true.
Graham Wheeler really struggled with it.
Yep.
Really struggled with
Right.
it. Bollard obviously found it hard as well.
Yep.
It's a very tough job, and you're criticised by everyone.
That's
but
right.
it's the way you handle it, right? And I think the way Orr handled it was, a bit too aggressive.
Okay. So he got people offside. Okay. Sorry, Craig.
I think that's fair. I think one of the things that Adrian did was he enjoyed the sort of the verbal part and getting into it more than perhaps a Reserve Bank governor should have. A lot of Reserve Bank work is done on a sort of a nod and a wink and leading people gently to a place rather than having these sorts of conversations in public. Whereas Adrian was very keen when he was criticised to push back quite hard at times, and that just encouraged more people to actually to criticise Adrian on the grounds that he would then push back in ways that previous governors may not have.
Right, so he wanted to get involved in the dialogue. I mean, and he did say at one point he maintained that the bank was one of the most transparent and one of the first to cut starting rates, but one of the most transparent in the world, Mike. This is a quote from Adrian Orr at one stage. So he obviously enjoyed the dialogue one way, as you say, but,
Yeah, I think possibly that speaks to, I'm not the first one to say this, he was a little bit arrogant in the way, he saw himself.
Right.
I think going to your first question is possibly why was he sort of asked to leave, is that, headcount had grown significantly during his tenure, that he felt justified possibly when Nicola Willis was asked to be reduced, expenses on things like websites, and even the sort of capital adequacy requirements
For the banks, right.
banks
Yep.
were very high, and I think there's probably been some pushback on that, and he would say, well, that's my domain, and
So
that's the way it's going to be.
lump it, like it, or I'll leave. Yeah.
Yeah.
And he's gone. As Craig Renney said before, when Adrian Orr was first appointed, no one could have predicted what was coming.
We will close our border to any non-residents and citizens attempting to travel here.
A trading nation was isolated, and with the economy on the edge, interest rates were slashed.
The OCR is being held at 0.25%, and this is
So, did Adrian Orr get that right?
I think the initial response to COVID was bang on. They cut interest rates, but more importantly, they supported financial markets. So I do believe that that the Reserve Bank's purchases of government debt was bang on. It was needed in the market. The market was panicking. What we disagree with was how far he went. So he went way further than we thought. He was preparing the banks for a negative interest rate, which I fiercely opposed. And I think a number of others fiercely opposed it as well. And he just went too far.
So when you say too far, are you saying too low? Because we got down to 0.25% in OCR. Was that too low?
I think you could argue why he got there quite and reasonably, but staying there for as long as he did and doing as more LSAT purchases than most of us thought were necessary.
Just explain LSAT purchases.
Oh, sorry. So large-scale asset purchases. So the Reserve Bank literally creates cash to go out and buy government debt, which pushes down the interest rates throughout the economy.
Yeah, and I think they printed about 71 billion. I think is the figure I came across in sort of looking back at that. Let's talk about the timeline though, Mike, about to understand after that. This is where sort of like the nub comes in, the criticism comes in. So inflation started ticking up in June 21, went from 1.5 to 3.3 and then to 4.9%. So that's like 3.5% in just 4 months. But the Reserve Bank started raising interest rates to counter that in October 21, and that was just by 0.5%. What do you think about that?
Well, I mean, it was still a challenging time because we were only just come out of that second lockdown. And I think Orr sort of prides himself on being one of the first central banks to actually start raising rates. But I guess in our economy, what we had seen, which you might not have seen in other places like the US, is a turbocharged property market, which was spiralling out of control from, people being able to borrow at 2.5%. And so that was creating serious problems probably as early as, 2020? Late 2020, so he could have started to gradually lift rates earlier. Right. Craig, what do you think?
I think, well, if we go back to the very beginning of this, Jarrod made a very good point about negative interest rates. The Reserve Bank, when it investigated negative interest rates, found the banks simply didn't have the systems to implement negative interest rates if they'd needed to. And I think that's one of the things that actually pushed the Reserve Bank into greater levels of LSAP purchase in order to push down the effective market rate for money rather than using the official cash rate lever. Did he go too far on cutting interest rates? We were at the effective lower bound with 2.5 already. As, by the way, were I think most of the reserve banks around certainly in developed economies around the world. New Zealand was the second reserve bank after Norway to start lifting interest rates. And at the beginning of inflation rising, there was a big debate globally about whether or not the inflation was transitory or whether it was here to stay, whether it's just one-off shocks associated with COVID, which would go back to normal. And if we started lifting interest rates very quickly, we'd do the opposite of market stability. Markets would panic at the consequence of that. So I think the Reserve Bank governor was in a very difficult place at that point in time. But I certainly agree we should differentiate between housing market inflation and general inflation. And I think the governor does have something to answer for in the housing market. And I think many of the criticisms levelled at him at general inflation are actually a bit unfair.
Okay. So the issue you're saying then, and would you agree with this, Jarrod, that the housing market just went crazy because of this? And he could have reined it back in.
Well, he did. The housing market clearly got out of control. I think one thing I'd like to say is that we have learnt a lot about monetary policy and fiscal policy over this period. And you think back to 2008 and why it took so long to get out of 2008 is because you didn't have the fiscal government response, whereas this time you had both a central bank and a government doing what was required to shore up the economy. And the bounce back that we saw, as mentioned, was something on steroids and amazing. But it just shows you how potent monetary policy is with fiscal policy working alongside it. So that initial response to COVID, yes, and any governor would tell you, I would rather face a 7.3% inflation rate rather than a -2%.
Okay, but it's getting it back in the bag, which is the key question after that. So if you get to 7.3, so they...
A lot of that inflation, though, was outside their control. The war in Ukraine has started, commodity prices were through the roof. There's nothing that he could really have done. He could put rates to 10. And inflation may not have come down.
Okay. Well, so
I think that's very fair. I think the governor was facing, much of the inflation was outside of his control. Shipping costs increased 1,100% in 1 year. Oil prices went through the roof. That was always going to feed through via tradable inflation into domestic inflation in New Zealand. The challenge we have right now is we have the opposite problem of what Jarrod has said. The Reserve Bank is now trying, I would suggest, to stoke a little bit of growth to try and encourage some growth in the economy. So it's putting its foot on the accelerator, but at the same time as the government's putting its foot on the brake in many areas. And so it's almost the opposite problem of the problem that we had at the end of the last government's period, where you arguably had the Reserve Bank with its foot on the brake and the government with its foot on the accelerator.
Okay, both feet not talking to each other.
Well, I was just going to say, the Reserve Bank's actually just still taking their foot off the brake. It's not on the accelerator yet. It's on the accelerator when the cash rate drops below 3.
Yep.
So we've had a recession and they've still got their foot on the brake.
That foot on the economy's brake was planted firmly when the OCR was ratcheted up. The biggest jump of 0.75% led to this exchange at a select committee.
What do you make of commentary yesterday in response to your announcement that you are deliberately engineering a recession?
I think that is correct. I mean, we are deliberately trying to slow aggregate spending in the economy.
But it's the corresponding speed of cuts once inflation started to come down that has led to the sharpest criticism of the Reserve Bank. Did they stay too high for too long? Craig, in retrospect, were they all too slow?
I think they were. They gave, the metaphor we use at the CTU is that the Reserve Bank gave the patient a lot of medicine, and we saw a lot of interest rate increases, but we weren't actually testing to see whether or not the patient had had enough. We just kept adding more and more and more. If we look overseas, Australia didn't see the same accelerated increase in the official cash rate. Its inflation came down faster than in New Zealand. And as a consequence, I do believe there's an argument for saying that the Reserve Bank possibly overcooked it on the increase cycle going up.
Yep.
And certainly it wasn't cutting it fast enough going down.
So that's right, 5.5% for almost a year, I think, Jarrod. So you were talking before about, the foot was still on the brake. There was a real reluctance to take that foot off the brake. I mean, we might just talked about, the May misstep, as I think we called it. What happened in the May misstep?
Well, basically in February, they were a little bit more neutral. Then from February to May...
This is last year.
Sorry, last year.
Yep.
Yep. From February to May, they became a lot more aggressive and pointing to the risk of rate hikes, not cuts. And they pushed out the prospect of rate cuts like 2026, 27, so well out there. Then from May to August, they did a complete 180. So the governor sprained his ankle doing that 180 on the spot, and they actually delivered a cut.
Yeah.
So how do you go from there to there? And the delivery of that message, I think, was terrible. But the outcome, we'd been calling for rate cuts, well before. We saw the economy, we saw our data turning at the end of 2022. So we were putting our hands up saying, stop hiking.
Yep.
Don't go to 5.5.
Yep.
And then we were putting our hands up saying you actually need to ease faster because the real-time data, the high-frequency stuff, has already moved. And you're looking at a GDP report, which tells you something 3 to 6 months ago.
Yep.
And it's poorly measured.
Right. And Mike, from an investment funds manager's point of view, why have you been so vocal about this?
Well, I guess it's because it's just taking money out of the economy. And so, like it or not, is that our economy is, by and large, driven around property prices. And so when property prices that we've seen in Wellington recently down 30% in nominal terms, not let alone what they are in real terms, people feel much poorer. And they stop spending and they stop investing. So that has a big impact on my business.
Yep, okay. So Craig, where are we now in terms of, the foot on the brake and the foot on the accelerator?
As Jarrod has quite rightly said, the Reserve Bank has identified, Paul Conway identified, the chief economist at the Reserve Bank, at a recent speech, the neutral rate for the Reserve Bank is between 2.5% and 3.5%. We're still, in the midpoint of that being 3%, we're still not there yet.
No.
And as a consequence, we still, to some extent, have the Reserve Bank saying, no, we need restrictive monetary policy at this point in time. We're in the steepest recession since 1991 outside of COVID. I would argue the time for the foot being removed fully from the brake by the Reserve Bank is here today.
So legacy then, is that Adrian Orr's legacy that we're going to be poorer for longer? Jarrod?
Oh, look, I think his legacy will be that he did get some stuff done, particularly around bank capital. We can argue how good or bad that is. I'm on the side that, a little bit too restrictive.
Right.
Obviously fought his way through COVID very hard.
Yeah.
Tried to do the right thing. But I think at the end of the day, he wasn't as good a communicator as had hoped.
Yep.
And I think he put a lot of people offside. I don't think too many people are crying over this one. I think we're just looking to the next governor with some hope.
So what do we need, Mike, in the next governor?
Well, we need someone who's going to communicate better with financial markets and the local economists, so we've got better forecasting. I think we want someone who is going to be proactive in terms of their data gathering, so not relying on old GDP data, perhaps create their own sort of...
So more real-time data.
Yeah, I mean, they've got 650 staff, so they should be able to get some good data from that. And then, of course, get the country down to neutral as fast as possible,
Right.
and then reassess.
Yeah. Craig, what do you think Adrian Orr's legacy is?
I think Adrian Orr's legacy is that he one of the things he did was he brought the Reserve Bank to New Zealand. He wanted to see all of New Zealand, Māori communities, Pasifika communities, all communities being able to see the Reserve Bank as is being part of them. I think the key challenge going forward for a new governor will be communicating, in a way that rebuilds the confidence of the financial markets in New Zealand in the governor, and not just talking to our everyday New Zealanders, but also giving them a sense that actually the Reserve Bank is an institution that is going to deliver financial stability, that's going to deliver financial system stability, and that is predictable. And I think the past few days have spooked markets a little bit because it's lost that predictability factor that certainly the Reserve Bank for the past 30 years had held.
Just that's the last point I just wanted to end on. Do we or have we lost a little bit of confidence in the institution of the Reserve Bank, not only because of what we've been through, but also in the way that Adrian Orr has left? Jarrod?
Yes, I think so, just a little bit. I think the Reserve Bank was one of the most transparent central banks on the planet. Not today.
And that wraps up this episode of the NBR Podcast. Thanks to Jarrod Kerr, Mike Taylor and Craig Renney, and thanks to content producer Jake Latham. For early access to new episodes, you can subscribe on Spotify. Or for all the comprehensive business news, grab a 12-month NBR.co.nz subscription this March for just $399. That's $100 off. Up next, the war of words over price hikes and regulation. It's airports versus airlines. I'm Simon Shepherd. We'll catch you then.